My husband cheated with my best friend, but a hidden $70,000 gift led me to a new fortune. He looked me dead in the eye and told me I was finished, that I'd lost everything. And for a moment, he was right. My husband, my best friend, my home, my job, even my sense of self, all gone. But what he didn't know was that a dusty suitcase tucked under a motel bed was about to rewrite my entire future and expose a betrayal far deeper than I could have ever imagined. Just 7 months earlier, my life was normal. I had a husband I loved, a best friend I trusted with my soul, a steady job, a 2-bedroom apartment where Mrs. Chin always smiled, and the maintenance guy actually showed up. It wasn't fancy, thin walls, stained carpets, but Justin and I had painted the living room together, hung wedding photos where the light made everything feel warmer. It was ours. My job as a marketing coordinator at Brennan & Associates paid the bills. It wasn't the glamorous career I'd dreamed of, but it was stable, predictable, safe. Marcus, my boss, was the kind of supervisor who praised you in meetings but never promoted you, asked about your weekend but never listened to the answer. I'd been there for years collecting reliable performance reviews, never questioning why raises or advancements always seemed just out of reach. I just showed up, made coffee, and did my job. Justin. He was a business consultant, or so he claimed. His schedule was chaotic, full of late nights and weekend trips, conference calls at all hours. He'd come home exhausted, kiss my forehead, and fall asleep with his laptop still open. I'd cover him with a blanket, a strange mix of affection and loneliness churning inside me. I was proud of his hard work, but secretly resented how little time we had together. We'd met 7 years ago at a dinner party, a charming stranger who actually listened. Our courtship was easy, natural. Dinners, city walks, lazy Sundays. He proposed in the same park where we'd had our 3rd date, and I said yes without hesitation. I genuinely couldn't imagine a reason not to. But over the last 2 years, subtle shifts started. Justin became protective of his phone, taking calls in other rooms, tilting the screen away. He grew vague about his work, picked fights over small things, dishes, groceries, how much time I spent with Natalie. Natalie, my best friend since college. My maid of honor, who cried with me at my wedding. She'd helped us move in, made jokes about our clutter. For 5 years, every Thursday night, she'd come over with a bottle of wine, and we'd talk about everything. Work, her dating disasters, my quiet worries about Justin and me drifting apart. She listened with what I thought was genuine sympathy. All marriages go through phases, she'd say. You two just need to reconnect. You're so lucky to have him. I believed her. Questioning your best friend felt like questioning reality itself. Who else could you trust? My mother, Catherine, had died 6 years earlier. A car accident on a rainy night. Wrapped around a tree on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. The police called it tragic, said she was going too fast, maybe fell asleep. But my Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister, insisted something was wrong. Everyone dismissed Helen's concerns as grief-fueled paranoia. Helen was the eccentric one, the difficult family member, always showing up with pamphlets about corporate corruption. When she died 9 months ago, alone in her house filled with filing cabinets, I felt guilty. Guilty for not visiting more, for not taking her seriously, for writing her off as crazy. Maybe she'd seen patterns the rest of us were too comfortable to notice. I went to work every day, paid my bills, kept the apartment clean, tried to be a good wife. I did everything right according to the unwritten rules of middle-class respectability. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, trusted the right people, and played by the rules, I'd be protected from the chaos you read about happening to other people. I thought loyalty meant something. I thought the life I'd built was real and solid and mine. Looking back now from that dingy motel room with its cigarette-stained walls and a bed that squeaked with every movement, I can see how naive I was. How carefully constructed my entire life had been by people who saw me as useful, not human. How every relationship I'd trusted had been performance art, designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. The apartment, the job, the marriage, the friendship, all of it built on foundations that were never real to begin with. But I didn't know that yet. Not sitting in my perfect, normal life 7 months ago, believing in the stability of routine and the protection of playing by rules that turned out to be written by people who had no intention of following them. I didn't know Justin and Natalie had been planning my destruction since before my wedding. I didn't know my mother's death wasn't an accident. I didn't know Aunt Helen had spent her final years collecting evidence while everyone dismissed her as crazy. I didn't know any of it until I found that suitcase with $70,000 and a note that offered me a choice between disappearing and fighting back. And by then, I'd already lost everything I thought mattered. Midway subscribe line. By the way, if you're still with me, still hooked on this unbelievable ride, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it helps stories of truth and resilience reach more people who might need to hear them. More unbelievable stories are coming. The suitcase sat on the motel bed next to me, $70,000 in cash spread out like evidence at a crime scene. Helen's note was clutched in my hand, soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. I read it again, trying to make sense of words that rewrote my entire history. They'd been planning this since before my wedding. My mother's death wasn't an accident. Finish what she started before they silenced her. I needed to understand how I'd missed it. How I'd lived inside such a monumental lie for 7 years without seeing the truth. So I let myself remember that Tuesday 6 months ago, when my comfortable illusions finally shattered beyond repair. I'd woken up that morning feeling sick to my stomach. Not the flu, but something deeper. A wrongness that sat in my chest and made it hard to breathe. I tried to ignore it, going through my routine. Shower, bland toast, getting dressed while Justin slept in. By 10 a.m., sitting at my desk at work, I couldn't focus. My hands were cold, my heart raced for no reason. The nausea intensified. Finally, I walked into Marcus's office and said I needed to go home. I expected resistance, but he just looked at me with an unreadable expression and said, "Feel better," in a tone that made the hair on my neck stand up. Like he already knew something I didn't. Like he was relieved I was leaving. The drive home took 20 minutes. I kept the radio off. Noise felt like too much. My hands shook on the wheel. I told myself I was being ridiculous, just a stomach bug and anxiety. But the dread grew with every block, a certainty that something was profoundly wrong. When I pulled into the apartment parking lot, I saw it. Natalie's silver Honda Civic in a visitor's spot. She had a key, sometimes stopped by if her internet was down. It shouldn't have been strange, but on a Tuesday afternoon when Justin was supposed to be at the office and Natalie at her own apartment, something about it felt wrong. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine running, trying to talk myself out of the feeling. Maybe they were planning a surprise for me. Maybe Justin was sick and she'd stopped to check on him. I cycled through a dozen innocent explanations, each one more desperate than the last. I finally turned off the engine, walked to the building, up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again. I put my key in the lock as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have said why stealth felt necessary. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside. Not the empty kind of quiet, but the occupied kind, where you sense people are home even when you can't hear them. I stood in the living room, my work bag still over my shoulder, listening. That's when I heard it, laughter, from our bedroom. Natalie's laughter, but not her normal laugh, the one she used when we watched comedies. This was different, more intimate. The kind of laugh meant for someone specific, designed to make that person feel special and desired. I'd heard her use it before years ago when she was dating someone she really liked. I stood frozen, staring at the closed bedroom door, my brain working overtime to construct explanations that would let me keep believing in the life I thought I had. Maybe she was on the phone. Maybe Justin wasn't even home. Maybe I was just sick and paranoid. But somewhere, beneath all the desperate rationalizations, I already knew what I was going to find. I crossed the living room, each step feeling like it took an hour. I didn't knock. Why would I knock on my own bedroom door? I just turned the handle and pushed it open. Justin and Natalie were in my bed, tangled in the gray sheets I'd washed 3 days earlier, looking at each other with an intimacy that doesn't develop in an afternoon. This was familiar territory for them. Comfortable routine. When they saw me standing in the doorway, the first emotion on Natalie's face wasn't shame or guilt. It was annoyance. Like I was the one interrupting something important rather than discovering that my husband and my best friend had been systematically betraying me. She didn't scramble to cover herself. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me with an expression that said, "Why are you making this dramatic when you should have seen this coming?" Justin got out of bed, pulling on his jeans with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me this wasn't the first time he'd had to get dressed quickly in an awkward situation. That realization landed harder than the initial shock of finding them together. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was routine, practiced, something they'd done enough times that the mechanics of it had become smooth and automatic. He looked at me with an expression that was somehow worse than guilt would have been. It was impatience mixed with relief. Like this confrontation was an inconvenience, but also something he'd been waiting for, because pretending had gotten tiresome. "Sam," he said, using that calm voice he reserved for when he thought I was being unreasonable. "We need to talk about this like adults. This isn't what it looks like." The absurdity of that statement almost made me laugh. It was exactly what it looked like. But he stood there in our bedroom, in the middle of being caught, and tried to gaslight me into questioning my own eyes. Natalie sat up, holding the sheet around herself with a modesty that would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. She had the nerve to look at me with something close to pity. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said, as if there was a good way to discover your husband and best friend were having an affair. "But honestly, Sam, this has been coming for a long time. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The presumption in that statement stole my breath. Not just that she'd been sleeping with Justin, but that she thought I should have known. That this was somehow predictable, even my fault, for being too stupid or blind to recognize it. That their betrayal was justified because my marriage had problems. I asked the question I knew I'd regret. How long? My voice sounded strange, too calm, too detached, like I was asking about something that didn't matter. Justin answered in the same emotionless tone, like he was discussing a business arrangement that had run its course. Does it matter? Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest. That word, pretending, it cut through me worse than any of the rest of it. How long had he been pretending to love me? How long had every kiss goodbye been performance? Every I love you a lie? And how long had Natalie been sitting on my couch every Thursday night, drinking my wine, listening to me talk about my marriage problems, offering advice designed to keep me complacent, while she was sleeping with my husband the rest of the week? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things. I just turned around, walked back into the living room, and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag from the hall closet. My laptop, chargers, toiletries, the practical things you need when your life implodes. Justin followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have the adult conversation. I left without another word. Walked out of the apartment I'd helped pay for, drove to a coffee shop parking lot 3 miles away, and sat in my car crying until I couldn't breathe. Then I called my cousin Emma and asked if I could sleep on her couch. That was 6 months ago. And now, sitting in this motel room with Helen's note and $70,000 in cash, I understood that Tuesday had been even worse than I'd thought. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated, planned, part of something bigger that connected to my mother's death and whatever Helen had spent her final years investigating. They'd been playing a long game with my life as the board. And I'd been too trusting, too naive, too desperate to believe in the stability of normal life to see what was happening until it was too late. I'd been on Emma's couch for 5 days when Marcus called. He wanted me in his office first thing Monday morning. His voice had that careful tone people use when delivering bad news. I told myself it was about a new client or a performance review. I didn't let myself think about the alternative. I showed up at 8:15, clothes ironed, looking put together, even though I felt like I was barely holding myself intact. Marcus waved me in, his expression a mix of sympathy and something else I couldn't quite place. Satisfaction, perhaps, hidden behind a professional mask. "Samantha," he began, gesturing to the chair. "We're restructuring the marketing department due to budget constraints. Corporate jargon, designed to sound official and impersonal. Unfortunately, your position is being eliminated." He slid a folder across his desk. I stared at him. Budget constraints? We just signed 3 new clients. I've seen the quarterly reports. We're not struggling. His expression didn't change. These decisions are made at levels above my control. I'm sorry, but the decision is final. I wanted to ask if this had anything to do with Justin, but a flicker of discomfort in his eyes stopped me. Asking wouldn't change anything. It would only make it more awkward. I took the folder, packed up my desk in 20 minutes, no one making eye contact. By 9 a.m., I was walking out of Brennan & Associates with a cardboard box and a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Later, much later, I discovered that Marcus and Justin had been college roommates. That my job had never been secure, always conditional on remaining useful to people whose agendas I didn't understand. But that morning, I just felt the ground shift again. Another support beam kicked out. The divorce proceedings began 2 weeks later. Justin hired Elizabeth Hartley, a shark known for procedural aggression. My court-appointed attorney, Gerald Stokes, seemed to have given up on justice decades ago. Elizabeth painted me as unstable, irresponsible, using my job loss and temporary housing as proof I couldn't manage my own life. Every detail became ammunition to justify why Justin deserved everything, and I deserved nothing. The judge, Robert Cunningham, moved through his docket with an efficiency that suggested his decisions were already made. Every motion Elizabeth filed, he approved. Every request Gerald made, he denied. Justin kept the apartment, the car, the furniture, the savings. The settlement left me with my clothes, my laptop, and barely enough for 3 months' rent. The worst part wasn't the material loss. It was watching Natalie take the stand as a character witness against me. She wore a navy blue designer suit we'd picked out together years ago, now used to testify against me. She sat with perfect posture and lied with the conviction of practice. She claimed I'd been unstable for months, paranoid, difficult. That Justin had stayed out of obligation, not love. Not a single word was true. But Natalie delivered each lie with perfect emotional calibration, her voice breaking slightly, her expression showing concern mixed with reluctance. Like testifying against me was painful, but necessary for my own good. Judge Cunningham nodded sympathetically. When Gerald tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Justin, Elizabeth objected. The judge sustained it immediately, cutting off any questions that might establish the affair's timeline or Natalie's true motives. I sat there watching my best friend of over a decade systematically destroy what was left of my credibility, and I understood. This had been coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce, all timed and executed with precision. After the divorce, Emma let me stay in her guest room for 3 weeks. But then her husband, David, started making pointed comments about me getting my life together. "She can't stay here indefinitely," I'd hear him tell Emma. "You're not helping her." I heard the doubt creeping into Emma's voice, the exhaustion. I started looking for anywhere else to go before she had to ask me to leave. My former colleague, Diane, offered her couch for 10 days, then decided my negative energy was affecting her mental health. A college friend offered a week, then remembered family visiting. Another let me stay 5 days before her roommate complained. Everyone was sympathetic, right up until sympathy became inconvenient. Right up until supporting me required sustained sacrifice rather than kind words. Then suddenly they remembered prior commitments. I understood. Nobody wants to live with someone else's crisis indefinitely. But the speed with which people retracted their support taught me how conditional most relationships truly are. How quickly compassion expires when it becomes uncomfortable. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance social media work to pay for a weekly rate at the Crossroads Motel, it felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finally finding ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. At least the motel didn't pretend to care. Rita at the front desk didn't offer falsy. Big comfort. Room 14 became my address, my home. The place where I'd eventually find a suitcase containing $70,000 and a note that explained why my destruction had been so systematic and so complete. Room 14 at the Crossroads Motel became my address 3 days after the last friend stopped returning my calls. I'd scraped together $200 from irregular freelance payments. The motel sat off Highway 52, the kind of place where the weekly rate was displayed more prominently than the nightly, where the sign out front had been missing letters for so long that no one bothered to fix it. Rita, at the front desk, had an expression that suggested she'd witnessed this exact scenario thousands of times. Women alone with duffel bags and desperate eyes, paying weekly rates while pretending this was temporary. She just took my cash, handed me a key attached to a green plastic tag with the number 14, and recited the rules in a flat voice that suggested the words had lost all meaning. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke layered under industrial cleaner. 2 cents fighting a war neither could win. The carpet was a brown pattern designed to hide stains, which meant it was probably hiding decades worth of them. The bed sagged in the middle, like it had given up on supporting anything. A small table, 2 mismatched chairs, a TV from the early 2000s. The bathroom was tiny, a mirror that made everything look slightly yellow. This was home now. This was what my life had been reduced to. I tried to establish some kind of routine. Woke up early, made instant coffee. Spent mornings applying for jobs. Marketing coordinator. Social media manager. Anything, dozens of applications, customized cover letters. Nobody called back. My applications disappeared into a digital void. In the afternoons, I'd work on freelance projects. Small businesses needing a Facebook page managed, or email newsletters written. The work paid poorly, arrived sporadically, but it covered my weekly motel rate with a little left over for food. Dinner was usually instant ramen. Sometimes I'd splurge on a can of soup. I'd eat sitting on the edge of the bed, watching TV shows I didn't care about, just for noise that wasn't my own thoughts. I avoided looking at myself in the mirror. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. The same face, but something fundamental had changed in her eyes. Something had broken and not healed, leaving her looking hollow and defeated. This was my life now. This was what betrayal and systematic destruction looked like. A motel room that smelled like smoke and failure. Meals that cost less than $2. And the crushing understanding that nobody was coming to save me. I'd been living in room 14 for 3 weeks when I noticed the suitcase under the bed. I only found it because I dropped my phone charger and it rolled under the bed frame. I got down on my hands and knees, reaching into the dusty space, and my hand hit something solid. Something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled it out. An old suitcase. Battered brown leather with brass corners oxidized to a dull green. It looked like something from another era. A luggage tag was attached to the handle with twine. When I turned it over, my hands started shaking. Samantha Marie Garrett. My full name in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. The precise, careful script of my Aunt Helen. I sat on the floor, holding the suitcase, trying to make sense of how it had gotten there. Helen had died 9 months ago. I'd been at her funeral. She'd lived alone for decades, died alone, surrounded by filing cabinets and old newspapers. Everyone said it was sad, but not surprising, given how she'd isolated herself with her conspiracy theories. How had her suitcase ended up under my bed, in a motel room I'd only been living in for 3 weeks? Had she known? Had she left it with Rita? The logistics seemed impossible, but the evidence was right there. The suitcase was locked with 2 brass latches. I checked the sides and bottom and found a small plastic bag taped underneath. Inside was a key. Helen had always been paranoid, but also practical. She hid things in plain sight, left clues that required careful looking, trusted that the right person would find what she'd left behind. I peeled off the tape, removed the key, and unlocked the suitcase with trembling hands. Inside was money. $70,000 in cash, bundled with rubber bands, mostly $100 bills. They smelled faintly of mothballs and old books, like they'd been stored somewhere for years. Underneath the money was a plane ticket, printed on paper that had started to yellow. Portland, Oregon. Departure date 4 days from now. And under the ticket was a note, handwritten on yellow legal paper in Helen's distinctive script. Samantha, this is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her. The truth is important. Use it wisely. I read those words 3 times, each reading making them feel more impossible and more true at the same time. Don't trust Justin. Don't trust Natalie. They'd been planning this since before your wedding. My mother, Catherine, had died 6 years ago in what everyone said was a car accident. Helen had insisted something was wrong. She'd pulled me aside at the funeral, whispering that my mother had been investigating financial fraud at the pharmaceutical company where she worked, that her death was too convenient. I'd dismissed it as grief twisting into paranoia. Everyone had. Helen was always seeing conspiracies. Now, I was sitting on the floor of a motel room, holding $70,000 and a note that said my aunt had been right about everything. I spent that night in room 14, staring at the money and the note, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the choice Helen was forcing me to make. By morning, I decided. I wasn't running. I was done being the person things happened to. I was done disappearing while the people who destroyed my life got to move forward without consequences. I packed my duffel bag with the few possessions that mattered. Clothes, my laptop, the $70,000 bundled in a waterproof bag. I left a note for Rita at the front desk, saying I'd paid through the week but wouldn't be returning. She looked at me with an expression that might have been concern or relief that her weekly tenant problem was solving itself. Good luck, she said, which could have meant anything. The flight to Portland left early on a Thursday morning from a regional airport. I'd booked it using Helen's cash and spent the entire drive trying not to think about what I was doing. Flying across the country to follow instructions from a dead aunt everyone called paranoid. Chasing a conspiracy theory that connected my husband's affair to my mother's death. Believing that the systematic destruction of my life was part of something bigger and more calculated than simple betrayal. When I said it like that, it sounded crazy, didn't it? But Helen's note was in my bag, the money was real, and the plane ticket had my name on it. Crazy or not, I was going. The budget airline charged extra for everything. I paid, because arguing wasn't worth the energy, then spent 3 hours wedged between a businessman who hogged both armrests and a college kid watching videos without headphones. I didn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop cycling through questions. What had my mother discovered that made her dangerous enough to kill? How deep did Justin and Natalie's involvement go? Had any part of my relationship with Justin been real? Or had it all been performance from the beginning? Portland greeted me with gray skies and rain that felt different from rain back home. Colder, heavier, the kind of wet that seeps through clothing. I rented a car using some of Helen's cash and a credit card I'd been avoiding. The address Helen had written led me out of the city toward Lake Oswego, a suburb that felt quiet in a way that suggested money and privacy. Houses set back from the road, each maintaining a polite distance. Helen's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. A small ranch-style place, built in the 70s, not updated since. Dark windows. A wild lawn. A cracked driveway. It screamed, someone died here and no one knows what to do with it yet. I parked, sat in the car, trying to decide if I was brave enough. What if the truth was worse than the lies? I turned off the engine and got out. The front door was locked, but Helen had left a second key in the suitcase, taped inside a small envelope marked House. I let myself in, stepping into air that smelled stale and undisturbed. The particular smell of a place where no one had opened a window or cooked a meal in months. The interior was exactly what I'd expected. Books everywhere, filing cabinets in the living room, papers organized in boxes. The kitchen looked barely used. But the note had directed me to the shed behind the house. I walked through the overgrown yard. The shed sat in the far corner, a small structure with newer locks on the door. That detail stood out. Everything else was old and neglected, but those locks were recent, industrial. The kind of hardware you use when protecting something that matters. I used the third key Helen had left, this one marked Shed. It opened smoothly, like it had been recently maintained. Inside, the shed was organized in a way that made the house look chaotic by comparison. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with years spanning from the 1980s to last year. Boxes stacked along another wall, indexed with professional precision. And in the back corner, partially hidden under a tarp, was a trapdoor set into the floor. I moved the paint cans, pulled back the tarp. The trapdoor had a handle and a lock. The fourth key Helen left fit perfectly. It opened to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed down into what turned out to be a crawl space, converted into a climate-controlled evidence room. 7 feet tall, 15 feet square, lit by battery-powered LED strips. The air was cool and dry, maintained by a humming dehumidifier. More filing cabinets, more boxes, a table with a laptop, and an old cassette player. Photographs and documents protected in clear plastic sleeves. Helen had spent years building this. A secret archive, documenting something she believed was worth preserving, even if everyone thought she was paranoid. I started with the photographs. The first one I picked up made my hands shake. My mother, Catherine, standing between Justin and Natalie at a conference. All three wearing name tags, smiling. The banner in the background said Meridian Pharmaceuticals Annual Research Summit. The date 8 years ago. 8 years. 2 full years before I'd supposedly met Justin by chance at a dinner party. 2 years before our relationship had started. I stared at that photograph, my brain scrambling. Maybe they'd met briefly. A coincidence. But I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. Justin hadn't met me by accident. He'd been positioned in my life deliberately. Cultivated as a relationship by people who needed access to my mother, and saw me as the easiest entry point. I'd been a target before I'd been a girlfriend, a mark before I'd been a wife. And every moment of intimacy, every declaration of love, every promise about our future, all of it had been performance art in service of something I was only now beginning to understand. I set down the photograph and reached for the cassette player. It was an old portable model. Next to it, a stack of tapes, each labeled in Helen's handwriting. I picked up the first. Justin Garrett and Richard Moss, March 2019, discussion of Catherine Vaughn investigation status. My mother's name. My chest tightened. I loaded the tape, pressed play. Static, then voices. My hands went cold. The first voice belonged to Justin. I'd heard that voice every day for 7 years. Heard it tell me he loved me. Make promises. Now I was hearing it discuss my mother like she was a problem that needed solving. Catherine's getting too close, Justin said, his tone businesslike, devoid of emotion. She's made copies of the trial data. She's been meeting with someone at the FDA. I don't know who yet, but I'm working on finding out through Samantha. A second voice responded, older, more authoritative. Richard Moss, we can't let this go public. The approvals we've secured are worth billions. If she exposes the data manipulation, we're looking at criminal charges and the end of the company. Can you contain her through the daughter? I've tried, Justin said. But Catherine doesn't discuss work details with Samantha. She's protective. Thinks she's keeping her daughter safe. It's actually making my job harder because Samantha doesn't know anything useful. Then we need to consider other options, Richard said. And something in his tone made my blood run cold. More permanent solutions. We can't risk everything because one accountant developed a conscience. I paused the tape. I couldn't breathe. They were discussing killing my mother, planning it like it was a business decision, weighing options, considering strategies. And Justin, the man I'd married, was part of that conversation. He'd been using me to gather information. And when that didn't work, he'd participated in planning her murder. I forced myself to press play again. There are ways to make it look accidental, Richard continued. We have people who specialize in this kind of problem. Car accidents happen all the time, especially on rainy nights on dangerous roads. Nobody questions those. What about afterward? Justin asked. If Catherine dies, Samantha's going to be devastated. She'll lean on me for support, which gives me more access to her life. But there's also that aunt, Helen. She's paranoid and suspicious of everything. If Catherine dies, Helen's going to start asking questions. Let her ask, Richard said dismissively. Nobody takes Helen Vaughn seriously. She's been crying wolf about corporate corruption for decades. If she starts claiming Catherine's death wasn't an accident, people will just think she's being paranoid again. The key is making sure there's nothing concrete for her to find. We clean up thoroughly, make sure the accident investigation is handled by people we can trust, and move on. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing logistics, contingencies, discussing my mother's murder with the same tone people use when planning a vacation. When it finally ended, I sat in the silence of Helen's underground archive, trying to process what I'd just heard. Justin hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been a plant from the beginning, positioned in my life specifically to monitor my mother's investigation into Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He'd courted me, proposed to me, married me, all as part of a strategy to gain access to information that might threaten a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. And when using me didn't work, when my mother kept her investigation separate from her family life, they'd killed her and made it look like an accident on a rainy night. I found more tapes. Conversations between Natalie and someone named Dr. Sarah Chin, apparently Natalie's aunt and a senior researcher at Meridian. These recordings revealed that Natalie had been assigned to befriend me after my mother's death, to make sure I remained isolated and manageable, to monitor whether I showed any signs of investigating what had really happened. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every heart-to-heart conversation, data collection, our entire friendship had been fabricated. I don't know how long I sat in that crawl space, listening to recordings, reading documents, piecing together the full scope of what had been done to my mother and to me. Hours. Long enough that my back ached from the concrete floor. My eyes burned from reading in the LED light. Finally, I found the laptop Helen had left. It was plugged in, fully charged. A note attached to the screen said, "Play this first." An arrow pointed to a video file labeled "For Samantha." I opened it and Helen's face filled the screen. She looked just as I remembered, though visibly ill. Her face drawn, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the camera, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She wore a cardigan I recognized, the same one she'd worn to every family gathering. "Samantha," she began, her voice steady despite her physical deterioration. "If you're watching this, it means I'm dead, and you found my archive. Which means you're probably angry and confused and wondering why I didn't tell you any of this while I was alive." She paused to sip water. "The answer is that I tried. I warned you about Justin at your engagement party. I pulled you aside and told you to be careful, that something about him felt wrong. I told you to watch how Natalie behaved around him, to pay attention to the small things that didn't quite add up. You thought I was being paranoid. You said I saw conspiracies everywhere and needed to let you live your own life." Helen's expression softened. "And I don't blame you for that. I'd spent decades being the family member everyone described as difficult and eccentric. By the time I tried to warn you about Justin, you'd already learned to dismiss everything I said." She adjusted the camera, leaning forward. "Your mother, Catherine, was my best friend long before she was your mother. We grew up protecting each other. And when she discovered what Meridian was doing, she came to me first, because she knew I would help her document everything properly. We spent months building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to go to federal authorities. Then she died in that convenient accident. And I knew exactly what had happened, even though I couldn't prove it yet." Helen coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she pulled it away, I saw blood. "I've spent the last 6 years of my life collecting the evidence you're sitting with right now. Every document, every recording, every financial trail. I did it because I loved your mother and because I love you. Because I couldn't let them get away with killing Catherine and destroying your life without any consequences." She looked directly at the camera with an intensity that made it feel like she was in the room with me. "You have 2 choices, Samantha. Just like your mother had 2 choices before they killed her. You can take the money I left you and disappear. Change your identity. Move somewhere far away. Live comfortably and safely. And never look back. Nobody would blame you for choosing survival over justice. You've already lost so much. You deserve peace if that's what you want." Helen coughed again, harder this time. She paused for a long moment. "Or you can fight. You can use everything I've collected and burn these people down. Expose Meridian. Expose Justin and Natalie and everyone who participated in your mother's murder and your destruction. It won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You'll be threatened. You'll be harassed. You might be in danger. But Samantha, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did." She smiled then, that crooked smile I remembered from childhood when she'd sneak me extra cookies. "Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. Your mother would be proud of you no matter what you choose. But I think we both know which choice lets you sleep at night." Helen's expression became serious again. "I love you, Samantha. Don't let them win." She reached for something off camera, then looked back at the screen. "Oh, and there's one more thing I haven't mentioned in the written materials. Mountain Pacific Credit Union account number 7743. Password is your mother's employee number from Meridian. That's the real fortune. The $70,000 in the suitcase is just travel money. Use what's in that account to fight or use it to run, but for God's sake, use it." The video ended. I sat there staring at the blank screen for a long time before pulling out my phone and searching for Mountain Pacific Credit Union. The call took 45 minutes of automated menus. Finally, a human. I gave her the account number. She went quiet. "Ma'am," she said, her voice suddenly much more professional. "I'm going to need to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold." The hold music was classical piano that sounded like it was being played underwater. After what felt like an eternity, a woman named Patricia came on the line. I verified my identity using my mother's employee number. Patricia paused for a moment before explaining, in careful language, that Helen had established a trust in my name. The trust contained stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and intellectual property rights that your mother secured before her death, Patricia said. The total value is approximately $14 million, structured to protect it from legal challenges and ensure that only you can access it. $14 million. The words didn't sound real. They sounded like dialogue from a movie about someone else's life. I was sitting in a dead woman's underground archive, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and murder, and now being told that I had access to more money than I could properly comprehend. Helen had spent 6 years not just collecting evidence but building a financial foundation that would allow me to fight without being destroyed by legal fees and endless court battles. She'd wrapped justice like a gift and left it with enough resources to actually achieve it. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Helen had left, I called Agent Maria Torres at the FBI's Portland field office. She answered on the third ring. "This is Torres." "My name is Samantha Garrett," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "My Aunt Helen Vaughn left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build about Meridian Pharmaceuticals." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked my phone. "Where are you right now?" Maria asked, her tone completely changed. "Lake Oswego at my aunt's property. Don't leave. I'm coming to you. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't touch anything else. And whatever Helen left you, just wait for me. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. Maria arrived in 35 minutes, suggesting she'd driven faster than was legal. Late 40s, gray streaking her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Jeans, a blazer, an FBI badge clipped to her belt. She looked at me standing in Helen's overgrown backyard with an expression that was part skepticism, part hope. "Show me," she said. I led her to the shed, down the ladder into the underground archive. I watched her face change as she took it all in. The filing cabinets, the boxes, the organized documentation of 6 years of investigation. She put on latex gloves before touching anything, pulling out files, reading with an intensity that made me understand why Helen had trusted her. "Your aunt was either the most thorough investigator I've ever encountered, or she was completely brilliant," Maria said after about 20 minutes. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly murder if we can prove the car accident was arranged. Samantha, you just handed me a case that could take down a major pharmaceutical company." The investigation that followed moved with a bureaucratic slowness that Maria assured me was normal. Subpoenas, warrants, freezing bank records. Former Meridian employees, fired or quit under suspicious circumstances, were interviewed. The pharmaceutical industry's informal network of whistleblowers started emerging. Maria helped me find a small apartment in Portland, a one-bedroom in an old building. It was infinitely better than room 14 at the Crossroads Motel, but I kept it modest, not wanting to feel like I was spending resources that should be reserved for the legal battle ahead. I used money from Helen's trust to pay rent and buy groceries, living simply while the investigation churned forward. I met with prosecutors, answering detailed questions about every piece of evidence Helen had collected. They wanted to know about Justin's schedule, Natalie's visits, my mother's behavior. I answered everything, watching them take notes, exchanging glances that suggested they were building something substantial. Maria called periodically with updates. "We're making progress. And don't talk to anyone about this." It was what federal agents say when they can't share details, but want you to know you haven't been forgotten. The waiting was harder than anything that had come before. I'd handed over everything, and now I was just existing in limbo, hoping that the machinery of justice would actually work for once. Months after I'd first met Maria in Helen's underground archive, things started happening with a sudden speed. It began on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Meridian Pharmaceuticals headquarters were raided by federal agents. Boxes carried out of a gleaming glass building. The images made national news, showing employees looking confused and scared. Richard Moss, the CEO whose voice I'd heard on Helen's recordings discussing my mother's murder, was arrested at his home. News cameras caught footage of him being led out in handcuffs, past neighbors, past reporters shouting questions he didn't answer. His life built on fraud was collapsing in real time. Maria called me that afternoon to tell me Justin had been arrested at his office. I watched the footage on the local news that evening, rewinding it multiple times. Justin maintained his composure, didn't speak to reporters, walked with his head up like he was enduring a minor inconvenience. But I could see something in his eyes. Fear mixed with disbelief. Like he genuinely thought he was untouchable, and was only now realizing how wrong he'd been. Natalie was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop in Seattle where she'd moved. She'd used her Meridian payments to fund a graphic design business. According to news reports, she cried during her arrest. The tears felt performative to me. She'd testified against me in divorce court without showing a single genuine emotion. Her attorney issued a statement claiming she'd been manipulated by Justin, that she was a victim herself. But I'd heard the recordings of her conversations with Dr. Sarah Chin. I'd read the documents showing payments made specifically to maintain her friendship with me as a monitoring operation. Natalie hadn't been a victim. She'd been a willing participant who'd cultivated our friendship deliberately to ensure I remained isolated and manageable after my mother's death. Every Thursday wine night had been surveillance. Every conversation where she'd encouraged me to trust Justin, to ignore my instincts, had been calculated manipulation. The betrayal from Natalie cut deeper than Justin's in some ways. I'd chosen to marry Justin, but Natalie had been assigned to me without my knowledge or consent. Our entire friendship had been fabricated. Then came the news about Judge Robert Cunningham. He resigned from the bench with a statement about wanting to spend more time with family. It didn't work. He was indicted 3 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. Documents Helen had collected showed he'd purchased a vacation home through a trust that traced back to Meridian. Every case he'd presided over in the last decade was reviewed. My divorce case was among the first. A new judge took 15 minutes to determine that the original ruling had been based on fabricated testimony and biased proceedings. Everything Cunningham had decided was vacated, erased like it had never happened. Maria called me the day my case review was completed. "Your marriage to Justin is being annulled rather than finalized as a divorce," she said. "The courts are declaring it invalid from the beginning due to fraud. You're also getting a formal apology from the judicial system for whatever that's worth." It was worth something. Not enough to undo the damage or erase the months of suffering, but something. The formal apology arrived as a letter, 2 pages of careful legal language, acknowledging that I'd been subjected to proceedings fundamentally compromised by corruption. It expressed regret for the harm caused by a system that had failed to protect me. It didn't undo the months I'd spent on couches and in motel rooms, didn't erase the trauma. But it was acknowledgement. Official recognition that what had been done to me was wrong. The trials began 6 months after the arrests and stretched across a year and a half. Maria had warned me that cases this complex moved slowly. Richard Moss went to trial first. His case became a media spectacle. Pharmaceutical industry whistleblowers testified about the culture of fraud at Meridian. Patients harmed by drugs rushed through approval shared their stories. A woman whose daughter had died spoke for 20 minutes about watching her child suffer. Forensic accountants explained money trails that connected executive bonuses directly to fraudulent approvals. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They returned with guilty verdicts on 17 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment. Richard Moss, 62, showed no emotion as he was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison and forfeiture of $40 million. I watched from the back row. It was like watching a long mathematical equation finally balance. Justin's trial was smaller, quieter, more personal. I attended every day, sitting in the same seat, watching prosecutors present evidence of his role in monitoring my mother, his participation in planning her murder, his 7-year marriage to me as an extended intelligence gathering operation. Helen's recordings were played. I listened to his voice discussing my mother like she was an obstacle, strategizing how to use our relationship for information. Bank records showed payments made to him throughout our marriage, proving he'd been compensated for every month he'd spent pretending to love me. His defense attorney argued he was a low-level participant, coerced. But the recordings showed someone enthusiastic and willing. The jury returned guilty verdicts: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, racketeering. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, Justin looked at me across the courtroom. His expression was complicated, something between anger and resignation, as if he couldn't believe the woman he'd married as part of a surveillance operation had been the one to bring the evidence that destroyed him. I looked back without blinking, without emotion. I was done being intimidated. Natalie accepted a plea deal. In exchange for testimony against other defendants, her sentence was reduced to 8 years. 6 months after her sentencing, I received a letter from her. 3 pages on prison stationery, full of apologies, explanations about how she'd been young and desperate for money, how she'd grown to care about me despite the lies. She asked if we could eventually find a way to forgive each other. I read it once, sitting in my Portland apartment with morning coffee, and felt nothing but a hollow kind of satisfaction. The letter was self-justification dressed up as remorse. She wanted absolution I wasn't willing to give. I filed it away. Some relationships can't be repaired and shouldn't be attempted. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. The civil lawsuit against Meridian Pharmaceuticals took another 2 years. They fought aggressively, but eventually, facing the weight of evidence that had already resulted in criminal convictions, they settled. Meridian had to pay $2.7 billion to patients harmed by their fraudulent drugs, fund independent safety reviews, and were placed under federal monitoring for 15 years. My mother's estate received $12 million in wrongful death damages. I inherited it as her only living relative. I donated every dollar to organizations that advocate for pharmaceutical safety and transparency. The money felt tainted. I already had enough resources from Helen's Trust to live comfortably. Instead, I used part of Helen's Trust to start the Vaughn Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating pharmaceutical fraud and supporting whistleblowers. We hired investigators, funded legal defenses, published reports that made pharmaceutical companies uncomfortable. The foundation became my full-time work, my way of channeling grief and anger into something productive, something that would have made my mother and Helen proud. Something that turned their deaths into a legacy that actually helped people, instead of just being tragic endings to lives cut short by greed. I still think about room 14 at the Crossroads Motel sometimes, sitting on that sagging bed, eating instant ramen with a plastic fork, wondering if I'd ever climb out of the hole my life had become. I keep the receipt from my last week there in my wallet, a reminder that rock bottom is real. That humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you, but they can't actually destroy you, unless you let them. Helen had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case and assembling resources because she believed truth mattered more than comfort, and justice mattered more than safety. She'd been right. The paranoid aunt everyone dismissed was the only one who understood how the world actually worked, who recognized that powerful people don't stop being corrupt just because you trust them or play by rules they ignore. Ending. The final truth Helen left me proved prophetic in ways I'm still discovering. Fighting doesn't always lead to winning, but not fighting guarantees losing. I built a meaningful life from the ruins of a fraudulent one. Messy, complicated, and fundamentally honest. The kind of ending my mother and Helen would have appreciated. The kind of story that reminds people that patience and documentation can topple empires built on lies. And that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply refusing to let corrupt people erase you from the narrative they've constructed around their own importance. I'm not the woman I was when I found that suitcase under the motel bed. I'm stronger than she was. More careful about trust, but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive, or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I'm grateful I'm not her anymore. If this story of justice and resilience kept you captivated until the very end, show your support by hitting that like button right now. My favorite part was when Samantha discovered Helen's underground archive and realized her paranoid aunt had been right about everything all along. What was your favorite moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of truth and redemption like this one. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're notified the instant we upload.